Something fundamental has fractured within the European social contract, reversing a half-century of economic assumptions. For decades, the foundational promise of the continent's social market economy was absolute. A standard 40-hour workweek was an unyielding shield against material deprivation. If a citizen sold their labor full-time, the state guaranteed, through structural design and wage protections, a life of modest dignity, stable housing, and disposable income. That baseline has silently vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable macroeconomic phenomenon that official narratives routinely frame as a temporary byproduct of inflation or geopolitical friction. The reality is far more permanent. A structural divergence has emerged between macroeconomic metrics, such as gross domestic product and export competitiveness, and the actual purchasing power of the domestic populations generating that wealth. Across the European Union, millions of individuals are discovering that full-time employment no longer prevents downward mobility. Instead, it merely formalizes a state of persistent financial vulnerability. To understand how this threshold was breached, one must look at the historical baseline established during the late 20th century. In that era, European fiscal models were calibrated to ensure that net disposable income comfortably outpaced the localized cost of essential goods. Taxation systems, while heavy, return tangible value through highly subsidized public infrastructure, and the housing market operated as a utility rather than a highly financialized vehicle for global capital. A single earner in a standard service or manufacturing role could reliably secure a multi-room apartment, cover utility bills, and accumulate savings. Today, the spreadsheets maintained by national statistics offices reveal that this equation has been inverted. By adjusting gross full-time earnings for the contemporary tax wedge, the total proportion of labor costs taken by the state, and subtracting the true unvarnished cost of housing, a map of the working poor emerges. This metric does not evaluate the absolute lowest income nations globally. Rather, it measures internal asymmetry, identifying where full-time workers face the highest mathematical risk of poverty relative to their own nation's median cost of living. The structural failure manifests with distinct geographic variations, yet its root mechanics remain uniform. In the Baltic region, long celebrated by international institutions as a laboratory of neoliberal resilience and rapid post-crisis recovery, the friction between external messaging and domestic survival is acute. Locals in regional towns outside the capital zones report a landscape defined by an absolute absence of regional capital. Where local factories and agricultural cooperatives once anchored the community, there are now empty town squares and high streets lined with shuttered retail spaces. In these environments, the state extracts nearly 28% of basic wages in taxes and social contributions, leaving a typical full-time worker with a net income that is structurally inadequate. When winter utilities arrive, the cost of heating old, uninsulated housing stock instantly consumes over 40% of that net paycheck. The remaining funds must cover food and medicine at prices that are increasingly synchronized with Western European baselines. The outcome is not visible mass protest, but rather a quiet, systemic demographic bleeding. Workers simply abandon their communities, migrating westward to sell their labor in wealthier economies, hollowed out by a policy model that intentionally suppressed wages to attract foreign corporate investment. Further south, in the Mediterranean basin, the collapse of the mid-century labor contract takes a different structural form. In deepwater tax havens and tourist economies, the influx of high-earning digital professionals, corporate entities, and global investors has created a hyper-financialized property market completely detached from the local wage structure. On paper, gross salaries appear stable, and moderate income tax brackets suggest a sustainable standard of living. However, because these economies exist on geographically constrained islands, or within dense urban hubs where land is finite, the housing supply is structurally inelastic. Landlords, responding to international demand, have escalated rents to levels that routinely mutilate up to half of a local service worker's net income. Because these regions must import the vast majority of their consumer goods and agricultural products at a significant premium, the residual income of a standard full-time employee vanishes entirely within local commercial networks. Socioeconomic assessments reveal a growing reliance on non-governmental food distribution networks by individuals who maintain standard 40-hour employment contracts in retail and tourism. The wealth generated by these modern high-tech sectors does not cascade downward. It acts as a physical weight, pricing the native workforce out of their own residential zones, even within the traditional core of Western European wealth. The mathematical reality of the working poor defies conventional expectations. In nations where gross annual salaries exceed €80,000, the presence of a substantial underclass seems structurally impossible. Yet, it is precisely within these hyper-wealthy zones that statistical distortion and housing inflation combine to create the most severe traps for the domestic working class. These economies are home to an international financial and bureaucratic elite whose exceptionally high compensation artificially inflates the national median income, because the official poverty threshold is calculated as 60% of that specific median. The baseline for what constitutes poverty is pushed upward. Consequently, a resident working a standard essential job in logistics, elder care, or hospitality is mathematically and materially crushed. They earn salaries that would signify luxury in Southern or Eastern Europe, but they must compete for housing in a market where a basic apartment requires an expenditure that matches or exceeds the total net income of a worker in lesser economies. The presence of hundreds of thousands of daily cross-border commuters further complicates the landscape, driving consumer demand and real estate values higher while their socio-economic vulnerability remain unaccounted for in domestic resident statistics. The ultimate driver of this continental shift is a profound transformation in the architecture of the European labor market itself. To survive the structural shocks of the past decades, national governments systematically dismantled collective bargaining protections, normalized precarious short-term contracts, and permitted the proliferation of irregular employment classifications. These policy decisions were defended as necessary measures to introduce flexibility and lower official unemployment registries. However, the long-term consequence has been the absolute institutionalization of low-wage traps. When these diluted labor frameworks intersect with a financialized housing market and regressive fiscal policies that place the heaviest tax burdens on labor rather than capital, the working poor cease to be an anomaly. They become a permanent, calculated component of the modern economic engine. Full-time work has been decoupled from financial security, transforming a paycheck from an instrument of upward mobility into a mechanism that merely sustains a worker at the baseline of survival. This hidden restratification of European society operates silently behind pristine corporate facades and glowing macroeconomic reports, obscuring a deeper systemic instability that is only beginning to expose its first structural cracks. But the raw data only tells part of the story. The true depth of this structural reversal reveals itself in the microeconomies of specific industries and the altering geography of Europe's urban fringes. When macro-level percentages are translated into actual daily transactions, the illusion of the standard working life dissolves completely. In the industrial heartlands and transport corridors of Central Europe, where logistics hubs have replaced traditional manufacturing, a new pattern of labor exploitation has become institutionalized. These massive windowless fulfillment centers, positioned strategically near cross-border highways, operate 24 hours a day on a workforce that is systematically insulated from the broader economy. Walk through the peripheral industrial zones surrounding Salzburg or Linz, and the sensory landscape is defined by a heavy mechanical silence, punctuated only by the rumble of freight trucks. The traditional local tavern, once the social anchor for the working class, has disappeared from these zones, replaced by rows of automated vending machines inside gravel parking lots. Here, foreign qualifications are rendered entirely obsolete by rigid local licensing laws. A certified electrical engineer from southeastern Europe or an experienced accountant from North Africa is reduced to a generic unit of labor, sorting packages or operating forklifts for 40 hours a week. Their gross compensation conforms to minimum wage schedules, but after the state extracts its punishing tax wedge, the remaining net income collides directly with an unregulated private rental market. Because public housing lists require years of continuous local residency, these workers are funneled into predatory boarding houses, where a single bed in a shared room costs half of their monthly take-home pay. This pattern of structural displacement intensifies as one moves toward the agricultural and tourism sectors of the Mediterranean, where the reliance on seasonal and flexible labor contracts has degraded the concept of permanent employment. In the coastal regions of Spain and Italy, the official introduction of specialized contract types, designed by state planners to artificially lower unemployment figures, has institutionalized a class of workers who are permanently employed on paper but structurally impoverished in reality. These individuals remain tied to a single employer, yet their hours and income fluctuate at the absolute whim of market demand. During the off-season months, the grand resort towns of Andalusia and the Balearic Islands present an unsettling landscape of negative space, long stretches of shuttered beachfront properties, dark hotel windows, and silent promenades where the only signs of activity are handwritten notices announcing indefinite closures. For the local cleaning staff, maintenance crews, and kitchen workers, this seasonal void means their income drops to near zero, even though they are legally classified as holding permanent positions. When summer returns, the intense demand for housing from international tourists drives rental prices far beyond what these local service workers can afford. It is now common for full-time restaurant staff in Ibiza or Palma to live out of retrofitted camper vans parked in hidden dirt lots behind the luxury venues where they serve wealthy international clients. The state celebrates the record-breaking tourism revenues and declining unemployment rates, but the actual workforce resides in a state of chronic, unmitigated housing insecurity. A parallel distortion occurs within the hyper-digital economies of Northern Europe, where the rapid expansion of the technology sector has created a severe internal polarization. In the Baltic capitals, particularly Tallinn, the sleek glass architecture of the tech districts stands in stark contrast to the decaying Soviet-era apartment blocks that dominate the city's eastern horizons. In these residential districts, the absence of modern infrastructure is striking. Cracked asphalt, unlit stairwells, and small, family-owned grocery shops that have been forced out of business by massive corporate supermarkets. While the highly skilled software developers and digital nomads drive up the cost of real estate and consumer goods in the city center, the traditional working class, the retail clerks, security guards, and public transit drivers, finds their purchasing power completely wiped out. The hyperinflation that swept through these economies did not hit all sectors equally. It acted as a regressive tax on the lowest wage brackets. A full-time retail worker earning a fixed wage faces the exact same energy tariffs and food prices as a tech executive, but the proportion of their income required to cover these basic necessities is unsustainable. Local social workers note a quiet, desperate shift in behavior. Families who previously maintained an independent lifestyle are now selectively skipping medical appointments and reducing their household heating to the absolute legal minimum, creating an invisible health crisis within the walls of these concrete suburbs. This systemic squeeze is further compounded by a severe demographic and fiscal crisis that is unique to the aging societies of Southern and Eastern Europe. In Italy and Greece, the structural burden of financing massive historical pension systems has fallen squarely on the shoulders of a shrinking active workforce. To meet these massive sovereign obligations, the state is forced to maintain exceptionally high Social Security contributions on entry-level and mid-tier salaries. This creates a fiscal paradox. A young worker is heavily taxed to support the retirement packages of an older generation, while their own contemporary wage is suppressed to the point where they cannot afford to form an independent household. The evidence of this generational fracture is visible in the demographic stagnation of major Italian cities. In neighborhoods where young families once gathered, the primary sounds are now the sirens of medical transports and the quiet chatter of elderly residents on park benches. Young professionals, facing stagnant nominal wages that have failed to grow in real terms for over 3 decades, are forced into a prolonged state of semi-dependence on their aging parents. Those who refuse this equilibrium leave the country entirely, accelerating a catastrophic brain drain that further diminishes the tax base needed to support the system. The workers who remain find that a standard paycheck is no longer a tool for building a future, but rather a temporary holding action against absolute insolvency. The structural failure reaches its logical conclusion in the extreme labor models of Eastern Europe, where global supply chains exploit the low tax regimes of developing member states. In countries like Romania and Bulgaria, the state has actively rolled back decades of labor protections to position itself as a low-cost manufacturing haven within the single market. By shifting the entire burden of Social Security contributions from corporations directly onto individual employees, The state has engineered a system where the statutory gross wage bears no resemblance to the actual net survival rate. In the industrial suburbs of Bucharest and Sofia, global automotive component factories and textile mills operate at maximum capacity, exporting high-value goods across the globe. Yet, the workers on these production lines exist in a state of manufactured poverty. The cost of basic food items in local retail chains is directly pegged to Western European distribution networks, meaning that a factory worker pays the same price for a liter of milk or a loaf of bread as a counterpart in Frankfurt or Brussels, despite earning a fraction of the wage. The response to this untenable friction is a massive, permanent hollow-out of the domestic labor supply. Entire villages in the rural interior have been stripped of their working-age populations, leaving behind automated bank machines, grand but empty houses built with foreign remittances, and a vulnerable population of children raised by elderly grandparents. The economic model achieves its goal of high GDP growth, but the human capital required to sustain the nation is systematically consumed and exported. Yet, the most surprising layer of this continental realignment remains hidden beneath the official definitions of wealth itself. Behind these macroeconomic statistics are real, individual lives being quietly reshaped, enduring a slow-motion degradation that leaves no physical wreckage but fundamentally alters human behavior. The crisis of the European working poor does not present itself as sudden homelessness or visible destitution on major commercial avenues. Instead, it manifests as a series of hidden, agonizing compromises made behind closed apartment doors, away from public view. In the residential blocks of Athens, Milan, and Bucharest, the signs of this erosion are subtle but ubiquitous. They are found in the persistent dampness creeping up the walls of basement flats, where full-time workers have turned off the heating to save €100. They are found in the low-wattage LED bulbs that cast a dim, gray light over evening dinner tables, and in the meticulous, handwritten accounting ledgers where parents calculate the exact cost of a school field trip against the remaining balance for basic groceries. This is a poverty of calculation, a relentless mental friction that occupies every waking hour of individuals who spend 40 to 50 hours a week performing essential services for their societies. The sensory environment of this class is defined by a profound enforced minimalism. In the communal kitchens of shared apartments in Luxembourg or Vienna, there is a distinct absence of the normal markers of domestic comfort. Refrigerator shelves are strictly segregated with colored tape, holding basic unbranded staples purchased from discount supermarkets that operate on the urban periphery. Here, full-time warehouse operators, cleaners, and retail assistants exist in close proximity but complete isolation, separated by different shifts and languages, unified only by the common denominator of their financial exhaustion. In these spaces, the traditional rhythms of family life have been dismantled. Parents working opposite shifts to avoid childcare costs become passing shadows in their own homes, exchanging brief logistics notes on kitchen counters before one heads to a night shelf-stocking role while the other returns from a daycare shift. The social fabric of the family unit is systematically ground down, not by a lack of effort or ambition, but by the sheer mathematical impossibility of their economic reality. This structural squeeze has given rise to an entire generation of the working poor who must actively manage the intense social stigma of their position. In Spain and Italy, where the downward mobility of the traditional middle class is accelerating, individuals who hold supposedly secure, permanent contracts in hospitality or public administration are forced to navigate a dual existence. By day, they maintain a professional exterior, dressing in crisp corporate attire to serve wealthy clients or manage public databases. By evening, they quietly join the queues at local, church-run distribution centers or social grocery stores, hidden in industrial alleys or behind heavy parish doors. The shame is palpable, an invisible weight that causes people to look downward, to pull their coats tighter, and to avoid eye contact with neighbors. These are not individuals who have fallen out of the labor market. They are its very foundation. Yet the system they support has detached their remuneration from the baseline cost of survival, forcing them to rely on charity to bridge the gap between their net salary and their landlord's demands. The long-term psychological consequence of this permanent instability is a profound sense of paralysis that prevents any forward-looking planning. When a 40-hour workweek yields only enough residual income to cover the immediate horizon of the next 30 days, the concept of a future becomes a liability. Young couples across the continent are systematically delaying or entirely abandoning the decision to have children, recognizing that a second dependent would instantly tip a precarious household budget over the mathematical line into absolute insolvency. The demographic consequences of this economic reality are already visible in the silent school corridors and empty playgrounds of regional towns across southern and eastern Europe, where the laughter of children has been replaced by the quiet, uniform hum of automated traffic and the slow pacing of an elderly population. The active workforce is effectively executing a strategy of demographic self-termination, driven by the rational assessment that they cannot afford to reproduce the labor supply within the current economic matrix. The institutional response to this widespread vulnerability is a layer of official bureaucracy that often exacerbates the ASOLA to the tune of the working poor. Social assistance frameworks designed during an era when poverty was an exceptional, temporary state of unemployment are fundamentally unsuited to manage a population that is fully employed yet permanently broke. Workers find themselves trapped in complex bureaucratic loops where earning an extra €50 through overtime can trigger an automatic cancellation of vital housing subsidies or child benefits, leaving the household in a worse financial position than before. The system effectively penalizes incremental advancement, enforcing a strict cap on aspiration and cementing individuals into a permanent underclass. This creates a deep, cynical detachment from the state itself. When the official institutions of a democracy consistently frame full-time work as the ultimate path to security, while simultaneously administering a system that ensures a permanent struggle for basic survival, the foundational trust between the citizen and the state dissolves completely. This reality brings the narrative full circle, exposing the profound fallacy at the heart of the modern European economic model. The continent has not lost its capacity to generate immense wealth. Rather, it has perfected a mechanism that extracts maximum productivity from its workforce while externalizing the cost of that workforce's survival onto charity, state subsidies, or personal exhaustion. The working poor are not a temporary malfunction of a complex system. They are its structural stabilization mechanism. Their suppressed wages are what keep exports competitive. Their high rents are what sustain the valuations of global property funds, and their heavy taxes are what finance the sovereign liabilities of an aging society. The glittering, post-industrial centers of European commerce, the glass office towers of Frankfurt, the luxury boutiques of Milan, and the hyper-digital hubs of Tallinn depend absolutely on a vast, invisible infrastructure of full-time employees who cannot afford to live in the societies they build and maintain. As night falls across the continent, this hidden machinery continues to turn in absolute silence. The last commuter trains depart from the grand central stations, carrying the cleaning crews, the security personnel, and the shelf stockers outward toward the dark, concrete housing blocks of the distant periphery. In those suburban flats, millions of individuals sit before low-wattage screens, meticulously reviewing the digital balances of their bank accounts, watching the remaining numbers dwindle toward zero after the automated rent deductions take effect. There are no sirens, no mass demonstrations, and no dramatic collapses on these quiet residential streets. There is only the soft, uniform clicking of calculators and the heavy silence of an entire continent of workers who have done everything right, fulfilled every requirement of the social contract, and yet find themselves completely marooned within the boundaries of their own full-time paychecks.